Okay. Good evening and welcome to everyone tuning in right now. My name is Jessica Paul and I am the events coordinator for Munro's Books in Victoria. I'm really pleased you are all joining us tonight to help celebrate the launch of George Abbott's new book, Big Promises, Small Government, published by UBC Press. Usually we would host an event like this in the bookstore, but alas, COVID has forced us to be creative in how we promote and celebrate new books coming out in 2020. And though we aren't able to be here in person, I'm just really glad that technology allows us to do these virtual events and enables us to continue to present events and celebrate books in a way that allows us all to be safe in the comfort of our own homes. The launch tonight will feature George Abbott in conversation with journalist Vaughn and will be followed by a question period. If you do have a question that you'd like Mr. Abbott or Vaughn to answer, please submit it via the Zoom chat box, which you should be able to access by clicking chat at the bottom of your screen. And now I'll introduce you to Vaughn Palmer, who will be leading the discussion tonight. Vaughn has been the provincial affairs political columnist for the Vancouver Sun since 1984, covering the feats and follies of 9 premiers in his time there. Born in Quebec, he moved to BC in 1967 and graduated from high school in Nanaimo. He then moved to Vancouver to attend UBC, where he worked on the student newspaper there. He began working at the Vancouver Sun in 1973, first as a reporter, then as an editorial writer and rock music critic. I'm very interested in that, in your stories from that. From 1980 to 82, Vaughn was the city editor for the paper, and then in 1982 to 83, he attended Stanford University on a journalism fellowship. He has won many awards during his career in journalism, including the Bruce Hutchison Award for Lifetime Achievement, the Jack Webster Award for Reporting, as well as the Hyman Solomon Award for Excellence in Public Policy Journalism. And now I will turn it over to Vaughn Palmer and George Abbott to continue the discussion and talk about the new book, Big Promises, Small Government.
Well, thanks very much. I really appreciate it. And I'll start. It's a great honor to be doing an event with Munro's bookstore in Victoria. In the time I've lived in Victoria, I believe I've deposited more of my checks at Munro's than at my bank. So big fan. And George, I'm not great on this technology, but I hope you're out there somewhere. Come in. I
am, Vaughn. Good evening.
Good. And it's good to be doing this. You and I have done television before, back in, oh God, years and years and years ago. I used to do a show on the cable channel, and you were first a cabinet minister who was on the show, and then a panelist. So it's wonderful to have you here again. Congratulations on the book. That is very exciting. And that's really good. And we're going to talk about that. But I want to start off, George, by congratulating you on, and I had no idea after all these years that you've been out of politics, you continue to exercise such enormous influence with the BC Liberal Party, your former party, because here, you have written a book about the consequences of what was formerly the biggest tax cut ever undertaken by a provincial government, which is the big tax cut the Liberals did on day one. You're going to tell us all about it in your book. And here, to honor it and commemorate it, the Liberals have just announced, because they're running for office, what would now be the biggest, and even bigger tax increase right now in the provincial sales tax. So why don't you start off and just talk about the kind of influence you continue to exercise with your former party?
Well, thank you very much, Vaughn, and thank you for, at the outset, acknowledging the remarkable influence which I continue to exercise over the Liberal Party, despite not being actually a member of that party anymore. But you're right, it is a remarkable influence I have. I was quite concerned, as you probably know, about COVID arriving just about the time we were trying to get the book launched, and of course, COVID has proven remarkably persistent. It makes it impossible to have live book launches and the like. So we're doing Zoom in all kinds of ways. So Of course, I contacted the BC Liberal Party. I said it would be really great if we could have early on in the election campaign a great controversy around a tax cut that I can weigh in on and shamelessly promote my book. So, you know, I wasn't really sure until yesterday when Andrew Wilkinson announced that the PST would be eliminated for 1 year and then reduced to 3% subsequently, approximately $10–11 billion hit, really in lots of ways dwarfing what was done in 2001. But it's a great platform for me, and I'm terribly appreciative that Andrew was willing to do that in order to ensure that my book sold more copies. So thanks for that. And while I'm thanking people, Vaughn, perhaps I can thank you for moderating tonight. A lot of people have said to me as I was inviting them to the event tonight how much they missed Voice of BC. They didn't miss me particularly as a panelist, but they missed you as a host. And so this is a delightful opportunity to reprise a kind of Voice of BC format. Also want to thank you for the great honor to me of writing the foreword to my book. I actually think it's the best part of the book. I hope not everybody agrees with me, but I think it's the best part of the book and worth buying. The book is worth buying just on its own because of your foreword. Never mind the 200 pages that I attached to your foreword. But thank you for that. Thank you to Munro's Books, an awesome institution here in Victoria. It is a fabulous bookstore. When Hollywood does a great movie about bookstores, it's bound to be in Munro's because it looks like a bookstore, and it's a wonderful bookstore. And they are such great supporters of local authors, which I am one. So thank you to Munro's, to Jessica, Paul, who has helped us so much in putting this together. Also wanted to thank Carrie from UBC Press and all of the team at UBC Press, who've been actually spectacular to work with as I was completing the book and as we launched the book. And finally, to the participants who are joining us tonight, fabulous to have you on board. I hope all of Vaughn's questions will be as provocative as his first one, and we can keep you both amused and scintillated with the discussion. Back to you.
Well, George, before this turns into a love-in, I will recount for those watching the exchange we had when you first asked me to write the introduction to your book. And I said, now, George, surely there are other people who are better qualified to do this than I am. And you said, yes, of course there are, but they all said no. So here I am. I think we're going to just circle right back now, and because we talked about the tax cut. And I mean, this book is about many things, but it really is about, it was a long time ago now, almost 20 years ago. The New Democrats have been in power for 10 years. The Liberals get elected, landslide in the spring of 2001, and a mandate like nobody's ever had before. 57% of the vote, almost every seat in the House. And on day one, their first full day in office, they cut income taxes, provincial income taxes by 25%. When the first year's hit was enormous. It was $1.5 billion when that was real money in the provincial budget. And the book is really about what that set in motion. Talk a little bit about just what happened, because it ground the government for an entire term. And the next election, I won't say the Liberals barely survived, but they lost that enormous mandate and 30 seats along with it.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things I talk about in the book, Vaughn, is the context of the times. What Gordon Campbell and the BC Liberals did in 2001 was, in some measure, extraordinary. The size of the cut at 25% was large, but it was a step which Alberta had taken about 7 years earlier under Ralph Klein in their tax cut and restructure. A couple of years later in Ontario, where again, I think they cut 30%, but it was over a few years. Tax cuts were very much the order of the day. And I point out, for example, the federal election of 2000, one of the big issues was how big a tax cut are you offering? There was a kind of view largely based on the experience of Ontario between 1996 and 2001, where they enjoyed for 5 years straight 4.7% increases in growth along with tax cuts. And so there was kind of mythology and magic associated with tax cuts. So we got to have one in BC, and that's not surprising. Campbell had repeatedly promised a dramatic tax cut, but never actually quantified it. He'd said 10%, 15% back in 97. In the 96 election, he had said 15%. So I think people were, including his own cabinet, when it was announced at the first cabinet meeting, surprised at the size of it. So, when I look back on this, among the things that I learned that surprised me for retrospectively looking back, that 25% tax cut was announced at a time where the province was already 1.8 billion in the hole. Just since March 15th. So the North American economy, the world economy was very flat. And I guess the question was immediately, well, what's this going to mean? Are we going to get the same kind of hit as Ontario had? Answer, no. Gary Collins, the finance minister, in his first fiscal update in July 30th of 2001 said, yeah, we're looking for a bounce from this tax cut. We anticipate 3.8% increase in revenues across the board. It ended up being 0.6% because if there was any magic to tax cuts, it was well tarnished, well worn off by the economic situation of the day. And I think really right through the 21st century, whether it's Kansas, the state of Kansas that did something much like British Columbia, or Donald Trump's America, even in times of buoyant economic growth, that has delivered $1 trillion deficit, the tax cuts. So it didn't work out, obviously, as was ideologically anticipated by Campbell and Collins. And, unfortunately, we had a balanced budget due in February 2004. We had to find $4.4 billion in savings, but at the same time, keep health, education, advanced education from any overt cuts, meaning all those dollars had to come from the 30% of government that was not health, education, or advanced education. That was really the genesis of the problems that later emerged.
I want to just point out to the listeners something, George, that you said there, which longtime political observers will recognize and not be surprised by, but relative newcomers looking at governments might be. And you said, when the cabinet found out that the tax cut was going to be 25%, so this is a team of people, 75 Liberals elected by the legislature and caucus, and a big cabinet. It was over 20 people. And they have their first meeting because it's the first day in government. And they're not invited to discuss how big the tax cut is going to be. They're told how big it's going to be, 25%. You may have to go out and defend it, but you learn about it not much longer ahead of when the news media learned about it. But the thing that so that's the first thing that happens in government, right? Is that you're not always in on all the decisions. I'm not sure when the New Democrats discovered the premier was actually going to an election, but I'm not sure he took them all into his confidence before he decided. The thing I'd like to focus in on is that set in motion, and you described this mechanism where you had to cut and you had to cut. One of the most sobering things about the book for me, and I covered it all, but to be reminded, is the way the brunt of that descended on some of the most vulnerable people in British Columbia, children in care of the government. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. No, I'm happy to. And you know, to address the earliest part of your question, yes, we learned about it at the cabinet table, and as I argue in the book, it clearly wasn't intended for debate and discussion. We received the press release, which would go along, advising the media and the public of the press conference an hour or two later. In there were all the details about what a 25% tax cut would mean to all of the 6 different categories of taxpayers in the province. So I mean, this was worked through in some considerable detail, and you know, not many cabinet ministers work for 5 or 10 years to get into cabinet, to resign at the outset of the first cabinet meeting on the first day in government. So you know, you sit back and you go, ooh, wow, and you know, surprisingly too, the Premier's chief of staff, Martin Brown, apparently learned about it at that time as well. And Martin said that on a few occasions in the Georgia Strait and elsewhere, including in an article today. So interesting. But what it set in motion, to address the main part of your question, Vaughn, was because of that commitment to protect healthcare and education, which goes back to '96 and goes back to some of the copying of platforms of Mike Harris's Conservatives in Ontario. Protecting health and education was a pretty persistent theme as governments undertook these sometimes risky tax cuts. So that means that 30% of government has to find any shortfall that exists to meet that arbitrary timeline around balancing the budget. There were huge cuts to the Ministry of Forests. I think 45%, agriculture 45%, environment 45%. I mean, these were huge cuts. And in the case of forests and environment, relatively substantial ministries. But those sort of medium-sized ministries, in conjunction with about 10 or 12 quite small ministries, maybe filled a third of the whole. So where the heck are you going to go to get the balance of that $4.4 billion? You go to the big social ministries, and I had the pleasure of leading one of those, Community Aboriginal and Women's Services. We had, as I recall, about a $650 million budget. Human Resources had a $1.9 billion budget, and MCFD had a $1.6 billion budget. So it was about $4 billion in expenditures those ministries had. So this produced what one former public servant described as a fundamental math problem for the government. By protecting health and education, it meant a lot of dough had to be found in the remaining 30%, and you can't get there without going to the big ministries. That's why I argue in the book, well, you know, we probably could have got away a lot better with 10%. With a 10% personal income tax cut, might not have had to try on a 23% cut in a caseload-driven ministry like the Ministry of Children and Family Development. That's where I think the rubber hit the road, the chickens came home to roost, and all of the other metaphors we can trot out there. But that's where things got nasty, and I think in lots of ways that's the most powerful part of the book is, you know, here's the real world consequences of doing something bold. So I can't help but to be reminded of the parallels to the current situation too, because $10 billion is a lot of money to be relinquished out of a provincial budget. And so I'm concerned, but you know, that's kind of my retrospective walk to where we got to.
that Ministry of Children and Family Development, which is where the poor, unfortunate children that are taken into government custody and going to foster homes, and there's a lot of sadness in that ministry, and always has been. But the other thing you talk about in the book is they were also reorganizing the ministry and trying to do it in a better way. And again, I mean, I know you did this book partly through your work at UBC as well. And it strikes me there's a lesson in there that you can reorganize or you can cut. They're both difficult. You cannot do the two of them at the same time. You can't reorganize the ministry and try to deliver services differently and expect to be able to cut the budget while you're doing it. You probably may have to increase the budget for a while.
Right. That is absolutely true. And the leading scholars on public policy development, Christopher Pollitt is one of the notable ones that I use extensively, make the point, and I think make the point in a very compelling way, that governments fail when they try to do everything at once. If you're hoping to reform education, for example, you wouldn't want to try to combine reforms in one area with, for example, cutting the number of school districts in half. You would get bogged down in the huge amount of change processes you were trying to do at once. So public policy scholars would advise, pick your battleground, pick it carefully, make it manageable, and move through it carefully. What occurred with the new era, 2001 to 2005, was, in addition to unleashing the tax cuts, first the personal income tax cuts on, I think it was June 6th it was, and then in July, basically doubling up the amount by adding in corporate and other tax cuts. In addition to doing that, the Premier set out in his mandate letter a series of processes which ministries were obliged to participate in as well, and if the ministers wanted to get paid, at least in full, to complete successfully. And among those were core review, where ministries were obliged to literally look at every program service that they provided and report to a core review committee and later to an external panel about why they thought any area of their ministry deserved to be continued into the future. So that was core review. There was a 1/3 deregulation obligation for all the ministries. There was a business subsidy review. There were half a dozen reviews that we were thrown into the middle of. At the same time, we were trying to figure out how to meet the 30%, in our case, Community Aboriginal Women's Services case, 30% budget cut, 50% staff cut, all of the processes, and fulfill 25 new era campaign commitments at the same time, all with a smaller budget. So, as I look back on it, some good things came out of it. I think actually the devolution process was surprisingly productive. That was another one of the processes that we were obliged to engage in. But I think, overall, it could have been a much happier period, particularly for the vulnerable and disadvantaged in British Columbia, had it been paced in a much different way.
George, your ministry was Community Aboriginal and Women's Services, CAWS. It had a nickname, and what was it?
That would be Ministry of Lost Causes, and we can thank Joy McPhail for that moniker. She used it she used it tirelessly in ministry estimates debates and elsewhere. Quite amusing. Joy did a great job of, as one of two people in an opposition, keeping us on task and in line.
One session, she was all by herself as a member of the opposition because her other colleague was on maternity leave. And it remains in the century or so that I've covered the BC legislature, one of the most remarkable performances I've seen. She really was something else. You know, cabinet ministers take an oath of office, and you managed to get an entire book full of insights over just one term of BC Liberal government. How did you manage to do that? Because you say you did, while respecting your cabinet oath, and I can't see any place where I could convict you of it.
Yeah, well, I hope not. Although, you know, if I was going to go to jail, COVID would be a great time to go to jail, really, because it's pretty much like that anyways. So, and plus you get paid actually while you're in there, I think, for working on license plates and that kind of thing. So it wouldn't be terrible if you did, but you're right. I don't believe I abused my oath of office, and I was able to not abuse it, I think, by a couple of ways. One, government leaks like a sieve. So, you know, I got all kinds of insights from your columns, from Les Lane's columns, from Judith Lavoie's articles, from, you know, all around, because, you know, if anything of any substance was going on, you'd get a sniff of it one way or another, and write a very brilliant article on it. So that was one way. The second way I think that those insights were gathered was by the extensive interviews that I conducted with, I think, something like 16, 17, 18 former public servants. They were very generous with their time and with their insights. I think one of the things that really surprised me as I asked them whether they would, off the record and with anonymity, provide their thoughts on the new era, was just how many of them responded with emotion to that request. And I don't mean emotion in terms of being angry at me, but emotion in going, oh my God, that was the worst period of my life, the toughest time ever as a public servant. And yeah, I'd like to talk about it. And so it was really interesting. And I think in lots of ways it was the same for me. Looking back at it retrospectively, I'm, God, how did I ever get through that? That was brutal. But the reason I got through it was the great public servants around me. I had a wonderful relationship with my deputy, Bob DeFay, during the period. So, you know, we could be honest with one another about, you know, what's going on in government, how are we going to get through this? You know, this is borderline insane, but here's what we're going to have to do. So, you know, that's how I think those insights came to gel in the book.
I hope you'll indulge me with my one How George Keeps a Secret anecdote. After this episode that was the subject, and I'll get to the second question in a minute. After the episode that was the subject of this book, he later became health minister and was assigned by Gordon Campbell to do a province-wide dialogue on health that was aimed at identifying ways in the health ministry where we could save money. And George goes all over the province and does this, and then goes and presents all this to a caucus retreat at Harrison Hot Springs in September 2007. And the story leaks out that while George is making this presentation to the caucus, a gentleman in the front row keeps interrupting and contradicting his findings, because the findings are that British Columbians like the healthcare system. They don't want an American-style system. Yes, they would like shorter waiting lists. That's like the executive summary. George is doing this, as his whole story leaks out. And the story that leaks out is that after a while, the minister, George Abbott, while he's making this presentation, says to the gentleman in the front row would you like to come up here and make the presentation? And the man he said that to was the Premier of British Columbia, Gordon Campbell. It was very unusual for anything to leak out of the Campbell cabinet, especially one that was as unflattering to Campbell as that. I ended up having George on a live television interview on that show I used to do on the cable, and I asked him about this. And George said, Vaughn, you know I can't talk about something that happened on the afternoon of September the 25th at Harrison Hot Springs at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, which is the best confirmation I've ever got for anything from somebody who was still respecting his cabinet. So to get to the Gordon Campbell thing, because when you look at that story about and the book, I would think it's fair to say a generally unflattering impression of Gordon Campbell comes about. What's your overall view of him as a premier? He's one of our longest serving premiers. What do you think is his legacy?
Yeah, well, I wrestle with that in the book, as you know, Vaughn, and I think there's almost two Gordon Campbells. Certainly, there was two Gordon Campbells politically. My sense going into 2001 was that Gordon had a sort of bag of ideological beliefs that centered on the efficacy of tax cuts, but also drew on a lot of the experience with Alberta, Ontario, New Zealand, Great Britain, etc., on what's called a new public management. So that was the process side of those early years, and I genuinely believe that Gordon thought we could do more with less. I think he genuinely thought that maybe not immediately, but certainly more quickly than they did, that tax cuts would pay for themselves. So I think he had a bag of ideas in his head that he played out during those early years. I think by 2004, 2005, Gordon had enough leading through austerity to last him for a lifetime. He had started to get, I think, because he did read, he did listen around Indigenous relations. He moved away from the anti-Nishka, protect the white folk kind of approach to Indigenous relations that he had in the late 90s and into 2001. I think he was moving away from that. He was looking to build bridges, to form agreements with First Nations. So that was a change. I think he was starting to think about issues around climate change, and of course, got religion on that. And I think, and I say this in the book, that Gordon's approach to health and education in those early years of the 5 great goals for a golden decade. The decade ended up being about 3.5 years long, but during that period, 05 to late 08, I think Gordon saw British Columbia competing with Ontario in terms of reforms to health, reforms to education that would make us the leader in those areas. So it was a more expansive, more activist vision, and it was quite at odds, I think, with obviously what played out in the early 2000s. So, that's my sense of Gordon. Some of it never went away, though. You recall literally a few days before Gordon finally resigned, he did that Hail Mary press conference, actually it was a provincial presentation to the public on probably what is now global, but the newscast to British Columbians said we're going to do I think it was a 10% or 15% tax cut. So he never really entirely got away from that affection for tax cuts. It would come and go, as would his kind of tendency to be looking at cuts. That emerged again in 2009 when we had the unexpected greatest recession since the Great Depression. He again went into the kind of cost-cutting mode. But there were really two different Gordon Campbells.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear you say that. I think the First Nations is probably the farthest distance I saw him travel, from being opposed to the Niska Treaty to the new relationship, which was a worthy exercise, well-intentioned. We've struggled with this issue in British Columbia history through our entire history, so it isn't surprising it didn't go as far as he hoped. And one of the first carbon taxes in the world. And I still think a carbon tax is better than cap and trade and all that other stuff. It's very innovative.
Yeah.
And he took it into a provincial election. So those two things, I think they're worth talking about. You said something toward the end, I think I saw in the book. Maybe this was an interview. This book ends in 2005. You were in government for 2 more terms. Any thought of volume 2, volume 3?
Yes, in fact, I do. So I am hoping that volume 2 will be something that I have tentatively titled, at least one part of the title, as The Roots of Discord. It will be a look at Indigenous relations in British Columbia from the colonial period through to the present, but focused exclusively on Indigenous relations. I finished off the final proofs for Big Promises, Small Government in late February, early March for UBC Press. And just about the time I finished those, we learned that we were going to get to spend a long period indoors. I thought, rather than either go completely nuts and stir crazy or become a full-on alcoholic, that I would write a second book. And the second book turns out to be The Roots of Discord, particularly during the time when we were all confined to barracks. Managed to get down about 170 pages in the second book. And since I was liberated to go golfing, less so, but it's coming together, and I hope at some point to have that. The third book will be on that fascinating period when I had the great honor of being for 4 years and health minister, and a couple of years I had the honor of being an education minister. Those are fascinating areas of public policy. And I think it lends itself to an interesting blend, as I hope I've provided in the first book, of looking at public policy dynamics around what was attempted and what was actually done. Obviously, look at the process, the conversation on health, and what the heck that was about, and how it delightfully ended in Harrison at 2 p.m. The other part of that story, by the way, just to complete it, is that later that day, I offered my resignation to Gordon as health minister, realizing that I may have offended him slightly by offering him the opportunity to take over my presentation. He clearly was troubled by it. He declined to accept it, probably for the best of reasons. So anyways, there's health, there's education, there's all of the fascinating stuff that happened there. So I think it lends itself well to a volume 3, and provided I don't either fall over dead or lose my mind through dementia or being enclosed too long by COVID, I look forward to getting that down on paper someday.
You sought the leadership of the BC Liberal Party, and you finished 3rd. And for a while there in the legislature, you used to look across the floor at the fellow who finished 3rd in that year's NDP race, and you were number 3 back and forth. And that was John Horgan. What's your assessment of John Horgan?
I mean, John is, I think, a friend of mine. I really enjoyed working with John as a health minister, but particularly enjoyed working with him as an education minister. John was looking for a new school out in his constituency, and I thought just handled himself really, really well in terms of the dynamic with an education minister. I think John has done very well as a premier. I'm impressed by his work. I think he has a terrific style. He is honest, jovial. At times, and you'll recall this, Vaughn, at times when he was in opposition, he betrayed a modest temper at times in the legislature. I'd say, somehow he is one of those politicians who has grown into a role, and he's grown into the role remarkably well. One rarely, if ever, sees that flash of temper. What one sees is a thoughtful and a respectful, and I think probably very effective leader in his cabinet and caucus. So, I think he's done well.
We got someone who's watching us has sent in a question asking you, can you explain a little more about the $10 billion PST tax cut? So as I understand it, they're talking about cutting the PST fully for a year. That's about $7 billion for 12 months. And then bring it back at 3% for another year. So that'll knock about $4 billion out. Yeah. So that's where the number comes from. And the other thing that's interesting about it is that they've said specifically that they won't cut program spending by the equivalent amount. And we're in, one of the things the pandemic's changed is public finance. We're into a $13 billion deficit already. So, this will just add to it, but it seems like there isn't an upward ceiling on deficits anymore, not federally, not in the United States, and maybe not even in British Columbia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's a novel coronavirus, and it's a novel set of challenges to governments, and governments are doing things that they have never done before in response to that. I don't think anyone could ever have imagined the size of deficit that we have federally, or the multi-trillion-dollar deficit that they are looking to incur in the United States. The whole world is going through this, and deficits are much larger. The way that I think jurisdictions are managing this, by and large, is the way Canada is, which is the interest rate is so low, you can convert that deficit to long-term debt at a hugely low rate, in part because of COVID and the recession, depression that is associated with it. So that's part of it. I would make the argument that yes, the current $13 billion or so deficit of British Columbia is justified. In fact, government didn't make this choice. COVID made this choice. Government is just struggling to get through the downturn occasioned by COVID. And I don't necessarily object to some increase in that deficit in order to provide stimulus programs that might help us emerge from that deficit. Where I part with the current BC Liberal leader is on whether a $10 to $11 billion investment in getting rid of the PST is an effective form of stimulus to help us move from where we are today to happier days down the line, where we can again return to, some semblance of balanced budgets and all of that. I think what the $10 to $11 billion foregone from the provincial sales tax means is that it closes up a host of doors for other stimulus programs. You recall that a couple of years ago, Vaughn, I did a report for the province of British Columbia on the fire and flood, and particularly the very, very difficult 2017 fire and flood season. There is $1 billion or $2 billion of work needed to fireproof and floodproof the towns and cities of British Columbia. Is a $1 or $2 or $3 billion investment in that area and it would be a great stimulus program. A horde of people would be put back to work, would be enjoying incomes, communities would be stronger, et cetera, et cetera. That to me, that strikes me as quite a sensible program to undertake if one wants to incur additional deficit in order to provide stimulus. Simply relinquishing all of that, all of those dollars that come from PST does not strike me the same way. Yes, some people will buy, perhaps, when they weren't going to die, but we didn't get into this situation because consumer spending was weak. We got into it because we're all confined to barracks for 2 months during the worst part of COVID, and we're still dealing now with a second wave, and lots of people are reluctant to get out. People are, I think, sensibly saving because they're not sure what the hell's going to come next. So I just think it's the wrong tool to employ in the circumstances which we are currently facing.
You were the Minister of Aboriginal Relations for a while, and you've talked about this second book you're going to do. Something remarkable that happened in the BC legislature last fall was the entire legislature unanimously endorsing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and passing a piece of legislation that will adapt that to BC law. And as with the carbon tax, it's something that we did before anybody else has done it. So knowing the file as well as you do, what was your perspective on that?
Well, I supported the adoption. Obviously, it's a big step. It will undoubtedly, as the provincial response to that document evolves, it will become a long-term argument point for lawyers about precisely what the UN declaration means. But I think it is a positive step. I think that's why it was unanimously adopted by the legislature. In fairness to the public servants of British Columbia, they now have to sort out in all of their respective roles, particularly on the resource side, just what the heck UNDRIP means. And it's gonna take some time to work through that. All of that being said, when I look at 160 years of BC's Indigenous relations in my book, for the greatest part of that period, and really for 140 years, our relationship with First Nations peoples was utterly destructive, and we need to do some important and consequential things to move that file along. So I don't object to UNDRIP. It is going to take some time to understand what precisely it means in terms of provincial public policy.
We have a viewer who has sent us a question, and the question is, you speak as though the 25% tax cut was a mistake, but the Liberals went on to win 3 more provincial election victories. How big a mistake was it?
Well, I think it was a mistake in terms of the magnitude and application of it. Clearly, since Liberals had been talking since really 1996 about a tax cut being a part of their approach to governing, I don't think that Gordon Campbell, and he wouldn't have hesitated anyways, but I don't think Gordon Campbell had a huge amount of choice in bringing in a tax cut. However, I think if they had taken time to look at the diagnosis, i.e. what was going on in provincial trade, what was going on in the provincial economy, what was going on in the North American economy, taking into account that the province was already 1.8 billion in the ditch when they formed government. I think that Gordon could have very plausibly, very reasonably argued for a two-stage 10% tax cut. It would have had whatever impact stimulus that a tax cut would have had without the adverse consequences that flowed from the magnitude of it. I reflected as well, Vaughn, in the book on the promise that was made by Campbell, and persistently promised, because you challenged him on it, among others, was that this was a tax cut for the lowest two tax brackets. That's what they committed to, having the lowest, I think, tax rate in Canada for those bottom two tax brackets. Well, what was produced was for all of the tax brackets, including the highest earners in the province, around a 25% tax cut. So for the individual British Columbian, for some, yeah, it was great. But the overall consequence of that tax cut was, pardon me, MCFD trying to find 23% in cuts in a caseload-driven ministry of some of the most vulnerable, disadvantaged kids in the province. Couldn't be done and could not be done for reasons I talk about in the book. That was the mistake. It was, I think, probably based on winning 77 of 79 seats, thinking you could do it all, thinking that British Columbia could show the world that with, enlightened taxes and this, focused leadership and all the rest, that British Columbia could lead the world and really show the world how this could be done. But in fact, we saw very quickly that, British Columbia is a small jurisdiction, less than 1% of North American GDP. Can we lead the world out of recession? No, we're very much exposed to the macroeconomics of the day.
An irony, because one of Gordon Campbell's tax changes did actually get the lead editorial in the New York Times and got attention all over the place, and it was the carbon tax, because it was the first of its kind, really. And as we just mentioned, he brought it in and then won a provincial election on it. I have a question from a viewer. You're going to love this one, George. You're going to love this. This is just going to make your day. Would George Abbott ever consider running for the BC Liberal Party leadership again?
No.
Well?
No, I would not. So I haven't actually been a Liberal Party member for a few years. I still get urgent pleas to provide them with the donations and the like, but I haven't been a member for a few years. As you recall, Vaughn, I had a kind of painful episode where the liberal minister of Aboriginal Relations asked me to be the chief commissioner of the treaty process. Then, after everyone else had approved my position, that is the First Nations as well as the federal government, the province turned around via some dark, foggy provincial cabinet committee and decided that I really wasn't the right guy for the job after all. So I thought that was kind of a poor way to conduct business, and let them know so. So that was my end. So and I'm 67 years old. I mean, I guess, now that I think about it, the guys that are debating tonight to become the president of the United States are 74 and 77. Yeah. A full decade older than me, and you for that matter, Vaughn. Perhaps I can make a comeback. I got 10 years really of my best years ahead of me. Just kidding. Just kidding.
Running in, on the old Coot slate, but seriously about the run, and I appreciate you mentioning the episode with the Treaty Commission, because it's even more awful than you described. You were being briefed on what the job entailed by the outgoing Treaty Commissioner when you got the word that you'd been dumped unceremoniously from a job that all groups had endorsed you for, which was a great tribute to you, the fact that you were endorsed. And we never really did get a proper explanation for what happened, although at one point someone suggested, if you know the old board game Clue, the suspicion that it was Mrs. Peacock in the kitchen with the candlestick had done you in, but and then big argument about whether or not the premier was Mrs. Peacock. But no, it's. Do you ever think though about, like, if you'd won that leadership, how things might have gone differently in British Columbia?
I do. I ran for a reason. I thought that I connected reasonably well with British Columbians. I really wanted the opportunity after working with Gordon for a decade. I wanted the opportunity to lead a government, because my political ideology, if you can call it that, and probably a kind of center-left guy in the BC Liberal Party. I thought there were progressive things that we could do as a government, which would win us support and make the province a better place. And you know, the only satisfaction I take out of the leadership run was that a poll, and I think it was Global Ipsos or something that combined to do the poll among British Columbians. I actually led just before we went to ballot. Unfortunately, not all British Columbians got to vote on it. So among Liberal Party members, I was in third place. And there I was.
We're just about out of time. What should British Columbians be thinking about going into this most unusual election in provincial history?
Oh, well, it's certainly gotten me thinking about questions around stimulus, questions around what kind of society do we want to be looking at on the other side of COVID. My worst nightmare is that there does seem to be consensus around running a larger deficit at this point in time. My nightmare is that the political narrative changes by 2024, and it becomes a contest for different visions about how we fill in the hole created by COVID and how quickly we fill the hole in created by COVID. And at that point, it'll be in the tens of billions of dollars, and people who are expounding a generous line right now will be saying, by golly, it is absolutely critical that we get this hole filled in quickly, and blah blah blah. And that's where, again, I think some of our core social programs come into jeopardy, because people are trying to meet times, benchmarks, time-related goals, and to get there, sometimes awful things are done. So I'm just not keen on doing awful things unnecessarily. We get enough awful things without working at it from a public policy perspective. That's why I'm a little critical about letting go of PST and the cost of that.
I recommend the book to people, particularly around, I remember the frenzy at the time to get all this done in one term. And when you read it now and you go, they were in power for 16 years. There was no need to rush through all this stuff. And then you read all the harm that was done, particularly, as you said, to the most vulnerable. We're out of time, but I'm going to ask you at the very end, because you discuss them in your book and we lost them last year. Say a few words about the role Ted Hughes played in uncovering the problems in this ministry.
Well, Ted Hughes played a huge role, remarkable figure. Of course, recently passed away, and the world is a sadder and lesser place for that. Ted was asked by the government, by the premier, to conduct a review of the child death review and the failure of the coroner's office to be able to pick up the child death reviews that had been done by the children's commissioner, eliminated by the core review process. I think the premier got way more of a report from Ted Hughes than he ever dreamed of. It was highly critical. Ted, quite rightly, looked back to that the budget cut, or the tax cut, which in turn produced the 23% budget cut at MCFD. He talked about how the concurrence of that huge budget cut, along with the process barrage that MCFD faced, was just disastrous for some of the clients, particularly children at MCFD. So, I mean, it's a cautionary tale about how one sets about to reform a ministry, and never trying to do too many things at once, particularly in such a sensitive and caseload-driven ministry. Ted very effectively brought all that to bear. He pointed a finger squarely at the premier for unleashing all of that at one time. The premier was, as I note in the book, not entirely forthcoming and fessing up to what had been probably a poor choice of public policies around MCFD. Yeah, no, I think it was one of those moments that cement in our minds just what a great role Ted played over a long period of time in this province.
All this and a lot more in George's book, which is highly recommended. And you might want to get your order in for volumes 2 and 3, because there's a lot more stories to come that are well worth telling. I'm going to hand it over. We're going to get thanked now, George. So I'm done.
Yes, I am here to thank you both so much for a truly fascinating discussion. I'm looking through some of the comments from people, and they all agree. Obviously, we weren't able to get to all of the questions that those of you tuning in had. Hopefully a lot of them will be answered in the book, which you can buy from Munro's. We have signed copies available. You can come to the store if you're in Victoria, or you can order it online on our website, munrobooks.com. They are signed by George. If you want a personalized copy, he has said he is willing to come down and do that if you want it dedicated. But thank you so much. This was really fascinating, and what a time for this book to come out with the election coming up and all of the madness in the US. And I think interest in politics right now is as high as it ever has been. I really want to give a big thank you to Carrie Kilmartin at UBC Press. She is the one who has helped me organize this. She's co-hosting. She's also running all of the Zoom stuff behind the scenes, which I am grateful to not have to do because I don't understand how it works. So the fact that it's gone seamlessly is all thanks to her. So thank you, Carrie. And I want to thank you all for tuning in. I know there's a lot of things out there that will pull you in multiple directions, so that you've given your time to us tonight is really wonderful. And thanks for joining us, and thank you. Have a good night. And thanks to you both, Vaughn and George. This was really wonderful.
Thanks everybody so much.
Yeah.
Good night.
Good night.
Take care.
And thank you.